Mary, a 72-year-old black woman, felt pain shooting through her chest. Each breath came with difficulty and the shortness of breath grew worse. Her heartbeat rattled in her ears, and thoughts of her grandchildren, expecting her grandson this coming weekend, were her only solace. She had always been a caring grandmother, sharing her love and life experience with the younger generation. But now she was finding it increasingly difficult to do the simple tasks that had come easily to her before. Gathering all her strength, she called a cab and went to the local hospital, hoping that the doctors would be able to help. On the first floor of the building, the walls of which remembered more than one generation of suffering and hope, she was met by a young doctor named Dr. Smith. He had blonde hair, a face full of smugness, and a cold stare that didn't bode well. "What can I do to help?" he asked, barely glancing at her medical records. "I have severe chest pains and shortness of breath," Mary said, trying to speak confidently despite her fear. Dr. Smith shook his head unhappily and, after making a few notes, began asking questions to which he seemed to already know the answers. Mary noticed his lips curve into a mocking smile when she mentioned her symptoms. He had already decided that her problems were caused by age and psychosomatics. "You don't have to worry, it's just stress and probably senile weakness. You just need to relax," he said without ordering any tests or even putting the stethoscope to her chest. Her heart clenched with resentment. She felt ignored, but at the hospital, where she had always been told she could count on professionalism, she hoped the doctors knew what they were doing. The next day, when her shortness of breath got worse and her chest pain became unbearable, Mary decided to go to the hospital again. This time she saw a different doctor, Dr. Jones. He, unlike Smith, took a genuine interest in her condition. With the necessary tests and examinations, he soon discovered that she was having a heart attack that had not been diagnosed in time. "How could you have waited so long?" Dr. Jones asked with concern in his voice. "You need surgery right away." Mary felt panic coming on. She realized that if it hadn't been for the negligence of the previous doctor, her condition might not have been so critical. After the successful surgery, she learned in rehab that she was disabled. Due to her neglected condition, her body had become weak and her heart could no longer perform its functions. Now, instead of being an active grandmother, she found herself confined to a wheelchair. Every day she had to face the reality of her new life of limitations and dependence on others. Frustration and anger at Dr. Smith never left her. Mary realized that her story was not just her personal tragedy. It was a reflection of a system in which bias and racism could destroy lives. With her soul overflowing with grief and just anger, Mary decides that she cannot just sit idly by. She will begin to fight for her rights, as well as the rights of others who have faced similar problems. The story of how a racist doctor misdiagnosed an elderly black woman is just beginning. Every day, Mary got worse. The pain in her chest became so severe that it felt like someone was clenching her heart in a fist. The shortness of breath made her feel like she was trapped in a trap where every movement brought physical pain. She tried to ignore these symptoms, but fear was building inside her. What if it really was something serious? Despite her fears, she couldn't allow herself to panic. Mary was a grandmother, and she had to stay strong for her grandchildren. That day, she decided it was necessary to call her daughter to take her to the hospital. She called, but her voice shook with pain, and it took her several tries to get the right words out. "Mom, are you okay?" her daughter asked worriedly when Mary finally managed to explain the situation. "I just want to check my heart," she said weakly, trying to hide the way her voice trembled. Soon they were on their way to the hospital, and despite everything she had been through, Mary tried to find the strength to be optimistic. She hoped for speed and accuracy in medical care. She had the conviction that the doctors would know how to help, and she would be under their caring care. However, thoughts of the racial prejudice she sometimes saw in people's eyes did not leave her. When they arrived at the hospital, the corridors were full of patients. The smell of disinfection and hospital drugs made her slightly dizzy. Mary knew it wasn't just a physical condition, but the result of her fear. She tried to pull herself together and waited her turn. This time she was met by Dr. Smith, the same doctor who had neglected her condition last time. When she saw him, Mary's heart fluttered with anger and fear. She felt something cold rise in her chest. "You again?" she said without restraint. Dr. Smith grinned as if her words didn't move him. He looked at her chart, raised his eyebrows and took a step toward her. "I see you're here again. What's troubling you?" he asked with obvious disdain. "I have chest pains and shortness of breath," Mary said, trying to speak as calmly as she could, but her voice was angry. "I think there's something wrong with my heart." The doctor, disregarding her words, looked at her with a kind of contempt. "At your age, a lot of people complain of such symptoms. Maybe you just need more rest," he said, dismissing her complaints. "But I can't breathe," Mary screamed, desperation overwhelming her. "I feel like I'm dying." However, his face remained impassive. He prescribed a sedative and told her that there was nothing to worry about. Mary left the office feeling hopeless. The next morning when she woke up, her condition had deteriorated to the extreme. The pain was unbearable and she could not breathe. Mary couldn't wait any longer. As she called the ambulance, she felt her heart pounding, and with each passing second, she was losing hope of recovery. When the ambulance brought her back to the hospital, she saw the doctors panic into action. The other nurses and doctors suddenly became attentive, as if her condition was suddenly important to them. Finally, she was examined by Dr. Jones. He quickly determined that Mary was having a heart attack that went unrecognized. "You need surgery right away," he said anxiously, seeing her suffering. "We can't wait any longer." Like a thunderclap, this news stunned her. She could not believe that she had endured unnecessary suffering for so long when her life was threatened by racial prejudice. Mary realized that now she not only had to fight for her life, but also for justice. Her story was just beginning, and she was determined that no one would remain silent about what had happened. When Mary was back in the hospital, her condition was already critical. The doctors quickly moved her to the emergency room, and she felt everything around her start to swim. Weakness flooded her body, and every breath came with difficulty. She was too scared to even close her eyes. Mary desperately searched for any hope, but the fear and pain were unbearable. Dr. Smith, the same doctor who had ignored her complaints, had re-entered her life. He seemed indifferent as he glanced at her chart. She couldn't help but notice the way he involuntarily curled his lips when his gaze fell on her name. That moment made her heart pound with anxiety. She knew his bias could be a mortal danger to her. "So, how are you feeling?" he asked with a fake smile, as if he really cared. "I feel awful," Mary said, her voice sounding weak and shaky. Dr. Smith, not paying attention to her, began leafing through her medical records while she tried to gather her thoughts to explain her symptoms. "I'm having a lot of pain in my chest and it's very hard to breathe. I think it has something to do with my heart," she said, more determined this time. The doctor only looked up at her, and his expression was as if he was looking at an invisible problem. He didn't see fit to perform an examination or order tests. Instead, he began taking notes, ignoring her distress. "You just need to get some rest," he said indifferently, not listening to her words. "You're stressed, and that's normal for your age. Maybe you should work on your psychology. Psychosomatics is a serious thing." Mary could hardly hold back her tears. Her heart was broken not only from physical pain, but also from humiliation. How could he ignore her suffering so easily? Her thoughts of racial bias returned again and again. She realized that he didn't believe her, not because she wasn't telling the truth, but because she was a black woman, and that fact was more important to him than her health. "But I can't breathe," she screamed, her voice louder, full of despair. "You don't understand. I can feel myself dying." Smith looked at her, his eyes filled with distaste, but at that moment Dr. Jones walked over to them. He felt a tension in the air and saw Mary shaking with fear and pain. "What's going on here?" he asked, turning to Smith. Dr. Smith waved it off and pronounced, "She's just exaggerating. It's nothing serious. Psychosomatic." Dr. Jones, unwilling to accept this version, moved closer to Mary and began to ask her questions. He noticed how pale she was, and her breathing became shallow. "Mary, I'm going to give you an examination," he said confidently. "We're not going to let this go unheeded." Dr. Smith, feeling pinched, hummed and went back to his notes. "Do what you want," he said with obvious displeasure, "but don't be surprised if you don't find anything." Dr. Jones, ignoring him, began to check Mary's condition. He asked for tests, and soon Mary was given the necessary tests. Time dragged on, and she could feel her strength leaving her. With each passing minute, fear grew inside her. She knew that if she didn't get help, things could end badly. Finally, the test results came back, and Mary saw Dr. Jones's expression change. He quickly ordered his colleagues to prepare her for surgery, and there was anxiety in his eyes. "You've had a heart attack," he said with determination, "and if we don't operate right now, you're risking your life." These words, spoken with genuine concern, brought a rush of emotion to Mary. She felt lost in this world where her suffering was unappreciated and ignored. She realized that her life was in the hands of the people who were supposed to care for her. But at the same moment, she knew that she had an opportunity to tell her story, and she would do everything she could to make her voice heard. With every moment of waiting in the hospital room, Mary felt her strength leaving her. She lay restlessly on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, where the white color seemed unbearably bright. All her thoughts revolved around the bias she faced within the walls of this hospital. Every moment that Dr. Smith approached her, she felt his disdain and racial stereotypes as if they were restraining her. He didn't look at her as a patient, but as just another case that wasn't worth wasting time on. When the doctor re-entered the room, his demeanor was unbearably cold. He looked at her chart and said with obvious irritation, "Mary, with the same complaints again? I think you should just try to calm down. We often see this in older black women when stress causes certain symptoms." His words sent a surge of anger through Mary. How dare he generalize her experience based on preconceived notions? Her pain was not imaginary, and she wanted him to understand that. But instead, as she only watched as he grudgingly wrote down his conclusions, assuming she simply had a psychosomatic disorder. "I feel like I'm dying," she exclaimed, her voice filled with despair. "It's not just stress. I'm really in a lot of pain." Dr. Smith, unresponsive to her words, only waved her away as if her suffering was inconsequential. "You should worry less about little things like that. Your age group is prone to such changes, and it's normal," he said with obvious arrogance, as if she were to blame for her condition. Mary felt rage overwhelm her. How could he ignore her suffering? How dare he generalize her experience based on racial stereotypes? She had already witnessed many cases of black patients being neglected because of preconceived notions about their health. "You have no right to talk to me like that," she shouted, her voice even louder. "I'm not just a statistic. I am a human being, I have a family, and I have a right to treatment." Dr. Smith just hummed, as if her words didn't matter. He got up to leave, but at that moment Dr. Jones entered the room. His face was serious, and he could feel the tension in the air immediately. "What's going on?" he asked, turning to Marion, then shifting his gaze to Smith. Dr. Smith, clearly annoyed, replied, "She's just hysterical. She's nothing serious, but apparently needs to be a little more attentive to her emotional needs." Dr. Jones couldn't contain his anger. "Smith, her condition requires careful examination, not dismissive comments. How can you say that? She is not your personal target for practicing your biases." Mary felt her heart fill with hope as Dr. Jones stood up for her. She knew that not everyone in this world was like Dr. Smith. There were those who could see her as a person and not a stereotype. "Mary," Dr. Jones said with sincerity in his voice, "I want you to know that I will do all the necessary tests and to make sure you get quality treatment. Your complaints are important, and you deserve it." Dr. Jones's words filled her with hope. He left the room to prepare all the necessary tests, and Mary was left alone, thinking about how important it was to fight for her rights. Despite being prejudiced and ignored, she has decided that she will not be silent. Her life mattered, and she would fight not only for herself, but for all those victimized by a system based on prejudice. Mary realized that her story could be a voice for others going through similar suffering. Her determination grew every day, and she was willing to do anything to get justice. The next day, Mary met Dr. Smith again, and her heart beat faster when she saw his face. The doctor entered the room with a smug smile, as if he didn't notice that her condition had worsened. He glanced at her chart and began writing down his observations with a detached look. "So how are you feeling today?" he asked, his voice sounding like he was discussing the weather, not the patient's health. "I still feel severe chest pains and shortness of breath," Mary replied indignantly. "You can't just ignore it." Dr. Smith only shook his head, and without waiting for her to tell him her symptoms, he said, "I can see that you are still under stress. This is pretty typical for your age group, especially among black women. Your culture probably imposes certain restrictions and expectations that cause you anxiety. Those words felt like they stabbed her with a knife. He referred to her race again, used her skin color as an excuse to blame her suffering on cultural problems. Mary could feel the anger building in her, but before she could say anything, he continued, I think you should take some sedatives. That should help you deal with the stress. Maybe if you just relax a little bit, it will all go away. He wrote her a prescription without giving her any examinations, without even mentioning an electrocardiogram or other necessary tests. It was the diagnosis she expected to hear, a mild form of stress. Mary couldn't hold back any longer. How can you say that? She screamed, her voice filling the room. I'm not just stressed out. I'm in pain and I feel terrible. Don't you think you should check me more thoroughly? Dr. Smith seemed unperturbed. He raised his eyebrows and his eyes filled with arrogance. We can't diagnose what doesn't show up on tests, he said, dismissing her complaints as if they were just annoying flies. Maybe you should think about managing your stress. His words pierced Mary, and she felt a wave of despair come over her. In that moment, as she realized that her health was being called into question because of prejudice and racial stereotypes, she realized that she needed to protect her life. A fire flared up inside her. She wasn't going to just give up. The forces that were trying to break her only fueled her resolve. She needed to see other doctors because she knew they were the only ones who could give her a proper diagnosis. I refuse to accept your diagnosis, she exclaimed, despite her weakness. I will insist on being examined. It's not normal to treat patients like this. Dr. Smith seemed shocked by her boldness. He shifted his gaze to her heart monitor, which displayed alarming readings. As if it was beyond his comprehension, he turned abruptly and walked out of the room, leaving Mary confused. A few minutes later, Dr. Jones walked in. His expression was serious, but this time there was sincerity in his eyes. Mary, I heard that Dr. Smith examined you again. How are you feeling? I can't just wait, she said, tears welling up in her eyes. He didn't run the right tests. I feel like I'm dying, and he just prescribes sedatives like it's normal. Dr. Jones frowned and seemed to be pondering something important. I will give you all the tests you need, he said with determination. You deserve quality medical care, and I will not let your case be ignored. Mary felt a spark of hope in her heart. She knew that her fight for her health was not over, and now she had someone to support her. This spark in her soul awakened a determination that her story would be heard, and she would not let anyone pass by her suffering. Mary knew she had a long way to go, but now she was ready to fight. Back home, Mary felt despair overwhelm her. Her apartment was small but cozy, filled with memories of her family. Today, however, it was silent with only the sound of her painful breathing. Mary tried to convince herself that everything would be all right, that Dr. Jones would really help her, but her instincts told her that something had gone wrong. She took the prescription Dr. Smith had written and struggled to summon the strength to go to the pharmacy. The sedatives he'd prescribed promised to relieve her stress and help her relax, but even with them, she couldn't get rid of the excruciating pain. Mary tried to follow the recommendations, but every day her condition worsened. She woke up at night with a sharp burning in her chest. Every attempt to breathe seemed agonizing, and though she pressed her pillow against her to ease the pain, it didn't help. Fear and anxiety were building up all around her. Unable to hold back, she cried, realizing that her health was in the hands of people who didn't take her seriously. Why can't I just be healthy? She whispered to herself, losing faith in doctors. A few days later, when her condition became critical, she decided to see another doctor. Unable to bear the constant pain and neglect, she called a clinic a little further away from her home. Mary didn't know that her decision would turn out to be a real challenge for her. When she entered the new clinic, she was filled with hope, but her inner anxiety did not leave her. When she was called for an appointment, she finally saw a doctor she didn't know. The doctor, named Alan, turned out to be young and attentive. He listened to her carefully as he studied her medical records. Mary, tell me about your symptoms, he said with a kind smile. I am here to help you. Mary felt tears come to her eyes. She quickly described her story, including her encounters with Dr. Smith and his disparaging comments. Her voice shook with pain and anger as she spoke of the bias she had encountered. Dr. Allen nodded, and his face grew more and more serious. He asked her to run some tests, including an neck and a chest x-ray. Each minute of waiting seemed like an eternity, and Mary felt anxiety rising inside her. Finally, the test results came back, and Dr. Allen returned with genuine concern on his face. "Mary, you had an undiagnosed heart attack," he said, his voice full of compassion. "You need immediate treatment. I don't know how it happened, but you shouldn't have to suffer like this." Mary felt her world come crashing down. All these days she had struggled with her condition, certain that the doctors knew better, that they understood her health. Now she realized how dangerous racial bias and misdiagnoses could be. All the stress she had endured and the fact that her health had been overlooked became all too apparent. "I can't believe it," she whispered, her voice becoming shaky. "How could this have happened?" Dr. Allen looked at her with genuine regret. "We live in a system where biases affect healthcare," he said. "But I'm here to help you. We'll start treatment right away, and I'll do everything I can to make you feel healthy again." Mary was grateful, but at the same time torn with grief. Her body was weakened, and she realized that the road to recovery would be long and difficult. Each step forward would drain her strength, but now she had a chance. Her heart was filled with determination to fight the system that had betrayed her. She would fight not only for herself, but for everyone who had also faced bias and misdiagnosis. With this new understanding, Mary knew that her story did not end here. She would continue to speak out until she got justice. The few days after her visit to Dr. Allen passed in agony. Despite his promises and appointments, Mary's condition continued to worsen. The pain in her chest became unbearable and she struggled to breathe. She tried to carry on as she had always done, caring for her grandchildren and running her household, but her strength was waning and her usual activities now seemed an impossible burden. One morning when she woke up in excruciating pain, she realized that she would not be able to get out of bed. Her chest pain and shortness of breath reached a breaking point. In panic-stricken, she called her daughter, who quickly arrived when she learned of her mother's condition. "Mom, you look awful," said her daughter, running into the apartment and seeing Mary struggling to breathe. "We need to call an ambulance." Mary could only nod, feeling her heart beating faster and faster. Every second felt like an eternity when the emergency services finally arrived. A couple of paramedics quickly assessed the situation and sprang into action. "We need to get you to the hospital right away," one of them said, sitting down next to her and putting on an oxygen mask. "You're not feeling well, and you could have a serious heart problem." Mary felt panic rising. She couldn't hold back her tears as she was placed on a stretcher and hurried out of the house. There was chaos all around and her thoughts swirled like a whirlpool. Mary couldn't help but remember exactly what she had been told the last time. It's just stress. Now that her body was betraying her, she realized that her life had been in danger all along. When they arrived at the hospital, Mary was lying on a stretcher, breathing heavily and gripped by fear. She couldn't shake the thought that her life depended on people who had at one point considered her suffering insignificant. All the stress, all the doubts and fears came back on her like black clouds. At the hospital, she was quickly surrounded by doctors and nurses. Mary felt vulnerable and helpless. She was forced to lie in a hospital bed and was hooked up to various machines that made constant sounds. She closed her eyes, sinking into darkness, and felt weakness take over her body. She was kept in the loop, with doctors running lots of tests, IVs, and medications. She was examined from every angle, but Dr. Smith's words were still in her head. It's just stress. Those words had become a curse to her. How could she have been so naive, believing that someone would take care of her health? After several hours of agony, when all the tests were completed, Dr. Allen finally approached her. His face looked tense, and as soon as he opened his mouth, Mary felt her heart sink. "Mary," he said with a serious expression on his face, "the tests show that you have had a second heart attack. You need urgent intervention." Mary pressed her hand to her chest, her heart pounding like it wanted to burst out. She realized that this wasn't just her problem. It was a problem with a system that had failed to properly assess her condition. Mary felt rage and despair come over her in a wave. "Why didn't you do it sooner?" she whispered, her voice full of pain and bewilderment. "How is it possible that I only came here after I was almost killed?" Dr. Allen looked at her with sympathy, but his eyes reflected the same rage she felt inside her. "I understand your frustration, and you shouldn't have had to endure this. he replied. "We will do everything we can to save you. But you should know that we don't have time." Mary felt determination fill her. She wasn't going to let this system break her. She had a chance to survive, and she wasn't going to give up this fight. She would fight not only for her health, but for everyone who faced similar BSSs. As she was wheeled into the operating room, she felt her heart fill with not only fear, but also anger. She knew this fight wasn't over, and she was going to do everything she could to make her story known. She wasn't just a statistic. She was Mary, and her life mattered. When Mary was wheeled into the emergency room, her body was weak, but her mind was still sharp. She could feel the adrenaline rushing through her blood as she was placed on the gurney, and the doctors and nurses began to scurry around, going about their business. Everything that was happening seemed hazy, like a bad dream, but she knew she had to stay alert. Soon Dr. Jones, whom she had already met at another clinic, approached her. His calm and confident expression inspired confidence. Mary could hardly believe she was going to see him again, but it gave her strength. "Mary, how are you feeling?" he asked, sitting down beside her and looking into her troubled eyes. "I heard about your condition." "It's terrible," she said, her voice shaking with excitement. "I feel like I'm dying. I've been ignored, and now here I am in this situation." Dr. Jones nodded, taking in her words with understanding. "We will run all the necessary tests and do everything we can to help you," he said. "I'm not going to write off your complaints as age or stress." Mary felt tears come to her eyes with relief. Her voice rose with determination. "I went through terrible agony. They didn't even do the necessary tests. I just can't deal with it." Dr. Jones, listening to her carefully, took notes and immediately ordered the nurse to run all the necessary tests, including an EKG and blood tests. He watched each step carefully, as if he knew that his attention and care could be vital to Mary. "I'll run more tests to see exactly what happened and how we can fix it," he said, confident and serious. "I know it's difficult, but we have to find out what's going on." Each second of waiting seemed like an eternity. Mary lay staring at the ceiling, immersed in her thoughts. She remembered all those times when she had been ignored, when her suffering had seemed unimportant to anyone. She remembered how, as an active member of the local community, she had always helped others, but now she was in that situation herself. Finally, the test results came back, and Dr. Jones returned to her with a serious expression on his face. "Mary, you have some serious heart problems, and it needs immediate intervention," he said. "We've seen that you've had 2 heart attacks, and if we don't act now, it could end in disaster." Mary felt fear engulf her again, but this time there was a spark of hope burning in her heart. Dr. Jones wasn't going to ignore her. He really cared about her. "What do I have to do?" she asked, her voice full of determination. "We'll get you ready for surgery to correct the situation," he replied, nodding readily. "You'll have a chance to recover, and we'll do everything we can to make sure it goes smoothly." Her heart beat faster, but this time from hope, not fear. She knew she had a difficult road to recovery, but now she had a doctor who understood her pain. She couldn't forget how she had been betrayed, but she knew she wouldn't let the event break her spirit. Dr. Jones looked at her as if trying to see what was going on in her soul. "Mary," he said, "I know it's hard for you, but you're not alone. We're with you, and I'm going to do everything I can to help you. Let's take this step together." Mary nodded, feeling her soul fill with determination. She was ready to fight, and now she had someone to support her. She realized that this fight was not just for her health, but for all those who faced bias and neglect in medicine. As she was wheeled into the operating room, she felt a fire ignite within her. This wasn't just her fight. It was a movement for all those who suffered from lack of care and attention. She vowed to herself that after her recovery, she would fight for justice in the medical system so that no one else would have to go through what she had to endure. When Mary regained consciousness after the surgery, the silence in the room pierced her. She opened her eyes and looked around, trying to realize what was happening. Everything around her was blurry, and she felt a sharp pain in her chest. Fear grew inside her as she remembered where she was and what she had suffered. She struggled to get her breath and tried to rise, but felt a strong pressure that made her lie back on the pillow. At that moment, Dr. Jones entered the room, his face lit up with kindness, but his eyes full of anxiety. "Mary, how are you feeling?" he asked, coming closer and sitting down on the edge of her bed. "You had a major surgery and you need time to recover." "What happened?" She barely spoke, her voice sounding weak, as if a whole year had passed. I, what's wrong with my heart?" Darjones sighed as if gathering his thoughts. "We ran all the necessary tests and the results showed that you had a serious heart attack that went undetected due to the negligence of your previous doctor. As a result, you developed several complications and urgently needed surgery to restore blood flow." Mary felt a wave of emotion wash over her. Anger, fear, and above all, a deep sense of betrayal. She remembered how she had been told that her condition was only stress-related, how she had tried to explain her pain, but she had simply not been listened to. Now that the truth had finally come out, it pained her to realize that her suffering could have been prevented. "Why? Why did this happen?" she whispered, clenching her fists with rage. "Why wasn't I rescued sooner?" Jones shook his head and his face grew serious. "I cannot justify what happened," he said. "Your story is a sad example of systemic bias in medical practice. We must work to make sure that this kind of situation does not happen again." Mary felt anger rising in her chest. She couldn't stay silent any longer. This wasn't just her personal tragedy, it was a systemic problem that needed to be fixed. Her voice grew louder. "I can't let others go through this," she exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with determination. "I want people to know what's going on so they won't be as helpless as I am." Dr. Jones nodded, knowing her words came from the heart. "And it's the right thing to do. We need to tell your story, and I will support you in that," he said. "But first you need to focus on recovery. It will be a long road, but you are not alone." In that moment, Mary realized that she had the opportunity to not only regain her health, but to become a voice for those who had been forgotten or ignored. She decided that she would fight for justice so that no lives would be broken because of bias and neglect. A few days after the operation, when she was a little stronger, she was transferred to the rehabilitation ward. There she met other patients who had also experienced difficult situations and suffered the consequences of the doctor's negligence. Each story was unique, but they shared the same pain, the fear of not being heard. Mary began talking to other patients, sharing her story, and realized that they were all looking for support and understanding. She decided that she could inspire others to fight for their rights and health. With each new day, she became more determined. With the help of Dr. Jones, she began to prepare a plan on how to get her story out to the public, how to make sure that others would not face the same biases. Mary knew her life had changed forever, but now she had a purpose. Her fight was just beginning, and she wasn't about to give up. As the days passed and Mary gradually recovered from the surgery, her inner conflict continued to tear at her soul. Every morning when she woke up and felt light in her chest, her thoughts returned to Dr. Smith and the terrible situation that had almost cost her her life. Anger and frustration gripped her heart like a hard vice. She recalled how when she came to the clinic, full of hope for help, she was not seen as a person, but as a set of stereotypes. Mary began to realize that her condition had been ignored because of the racial prejudice that the doctor carried around like a heavy burden. These thoughts filled her mind, causing a storm of emotions that she found difficult to cope with. Every time she tried to concentrate on getting better, images popped into her head. Mary saw herself in line at the clinic when Dr. Smith, with a flippant expression on his face, dismissed her words, writing it off as lack of intelligence or age. She felt not only sick, but betrayed. Once, as she sat in the rehabilitation room among the other patients, their conversations became to her like the sounds of distant music, while her thoughts returned to Dr. Smith. She pictured his face with a haughty grin as he spoke words full of disdain. "It's just old age," he said. "You need to exercise more and think less about your illnesses." She bit her lip, suppressing the indignation growing inside her. How could he not understand? How could he reject her without even showing any desire to find out what was going on? Every day she saw people who'd been through similar situations, and a realization grew inside her. She wasn't the only one who'd faced similar biases, but that didn't lessen her personal pain. Mary clenched her fists and her thoughts were filled with the image of Dr. Smith. She wanted him to answer for his actions. She imagined what a confrontation would look like, where she would stand up to him, make him see her real pain. That would be fair. What are you waiting for? A sudden thought struck her. Why don't you just tell everyone what happened? Her mind oscillated between fear and determination. On the one hand, she felt she could be a voice for many, but on the other, the realization that she would have to face a system that led her to suffer was frightening. What if she wasn't taken seriously? What if she wasn't believed again? Mary took a deep breath, trying to calm herself down. She realized that staying in the shadows wasn't the right thing to do. Every day, she met people who faced the same prejudiced views, and she needed to do something. The next morning, she decided to talk to Dr. Jones about her feelings and thoughts. When he entered her room, she met him with a determined look. "Dr. Jones," she began, her voice sounding firm, "I need you to know how I feel. I'm still struggling with what happened. I realize that this isn't just my personal story. It's something that happens to a lot of people who face bias." Dr. Jones looked at her carefully, his face reflecting support. "I'm here to help you, Mary," he said, leaning closer. "I realize this isn't easy, it hurts, and you have a right to those feelings. But we can use your story to make a difference." Her inner conflict continued to rage, but the doctor's words were hopeful. She knew she had support behind her, and that was what she needed. "I want my story to be heard." "Yeah," she said, her voice filled with determination. "I want others to know what's going on, so that people don't suffer like I did." Dr. Jones nodded, his eyes glowing with understanding. "We're going to make it happen. I will help you create a platform where you can share your experiences so that this is the beginning of change in the system." With each word, Mary felt her anger gradually turn to strength. She realized that although her heart still felt the pain of betrayal, she could turn her suffering into a powerful weapon. With this determination, she began a new chapter of her life, full of fighting for justice and supporting others who were forgotten in a system that was supposed to care for them. After successful treatment, Mary was lying on a bed in the rehabilitation unit feeling energized and hopeful. She felt more restored than ever, and now she couldn't wait to tell her story. She had a chance to not only change her destiny, but to impact the lives of others. She knew that silence was no longer an option. Each day, her resolve grew stronger. Mary knew it was necessary to file a complaint against Dr. Smith. She couldn't let his bias go unpunished, and she couldn't let other patients face similar negligence again. The day she went to see Dr. Jones, her heart was pounding with excitement. As she sat in his office, she felt the walls around her shrink. "Dr. Jones," she began, trying to speak calmly, though her excitement bubbled up inside her like boiling milk. "I want to file a complaint against Dr. Smith." Dr. Jones looked at her with respect, understanding how difficult this was for her. "It's the right thing to do," he said. "I am ready to support you in this. We need to gather all the necessary materials to make your case strong and convincing." Mary nodded, but the storm was still raging inside her. She remembered how she'd been diagnosed, how she'd been ignored when she tried to talk about her symptoms. She relived the moment when Dr. Smith, with an arrogant smirk, had sent her home, assuring her there was nothing wrong with her. "I want everyone to know this is happening," she said, her voice filled with anger. "I can't let anyone else go through this. These prejudiced views aren't just a mistake, they're a crime." Dr. Jones nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. He began gathering documents, and together they drafted a statement of complaint, detailing all the facts, circumstances, and consequences. After days of hard work as they fought for the truth, Mary finally signed the application and sent it to the Medical Association. Her heart raced as she sent it off. It was like the moment when you let go of a balloon, hoping it doesn't fall too fast. But now she not only had a fight against bias in medicine, but also a need to share her story with others. She decided to hold a press conference to raise awareness about racial discrimination in medicine. This was her opportunity to change the world, albeit in small steps. On the day of the press conference, she approached the microphone, her heart beating fast, but strength growing inside her. She saw the people who had come to support her, friends, family, and even some of the patients she had met in the rehabilitation unit. "Thank you for coming," she began, trying to sound confident. "I am here to tell my story because we have been silent for too long. I am an elderly Black woman, And my case is just one of many where bias and racism have caused misfortune. Mary shared her experiences, talking about how she was ignored and undervalued, how she struggled with the doctor who was supposed to care for her. The anger she felt turned into a powerful flow of words. She could feel people listening to her, absorbing every word, and it gave her confidence. I've been through hell, but my story is not just about my grief, she continued. It's a story about how many people go unnoticed because they are ignored because of the color of their skin. That has to change. With each word, she felt her anger and anguish turn to hope. Mary talked about bias, about the importance of demanding justice and care from the system that is supposed to protect her. Applause followed her speech, and she felt tears come to her eyes. But they were tears of joy and relief because she was not alone. Her story had become a voice for many. Soon after, the press began to take an interest in her story. Journalists asked questions and cameras captured every moment, showing Mary's transformation from victim to fighter. She knew this was just the beginning. Mary was ready to fight for justice, not only for herself, but for everyone who faced bias and inequality in medicine. Her inner conflict became her strength, and she was determined to continue her fight until she saw a change in a system that was supposed to care for everyone, regardless of skin color. It had been several months since Mary spoke at the press conference, and her story was finally being publicized. She watched as media, activists, and ordinary people began to raise important questions about racial discrimination in healthcare. With each passing day, hope for change grew in her heart. She knew that her voice had become part of a larger movement that sought to create a new reality where no one would suffer because of bias. But the more she shared her experiences, the more she realized how deep and systemic the problems were. Mary became a true patient advocate, participating in seminars and public discussions, teaching people how to recognize and confront bias in medical practice. Her own suffering became a catalyst for many others, and she saw many people inspired by her story begin to speak openly about their experiences. She often recalled how indifferently she was ignored, how biases led to misfortunes that could have been prevented. Every time she heard of a new case of discrimination in healthcare settings, her heart clenched. She knew that her fight was not over, and that her call for justice must be heard in order to change the system. Mary went to the legislature trying to make changes in the laws that pertain to healthcare. She spoke to local officials explaining how important it was to change the way doctors were trained to recognize their biases and understand how it affected their patients. She pushed for the implementation of programs that teach medical professionals how to recognize and prevent discrimination in their practices. Each time Mary spoke of her struggle, she felt the anger that once burned her now become her weapon in the fight for justice. But at the same time, she realized that this battle required tremendous effort, patience, and perseverance. Every day, she had to face the inertia of the system, the excuses and defenses of the status quo. The difficulties that came her way only fueled her determination. Mary knew that her story was not just about her suffering. It was the story of thousands who have faced similar bias and neglect. She was not going to be silent and was ready to fight to the end. A new moral emerged in her heart. Every life matters, and no one should be left in the background because of skin color or age. Her journey was a lesson in the importance of hearing each other, showing compassion, and not allowing biases to rule our lives. As Mary concluded her story, she realized that although she had experienced terrible moments, she had also found strength and like-minded people willing to stand together in the fight for justice. Even though her life would never be the same again, she was able to contribute to a better world where every patient would be heard and every doctor would be not just a professional, but an advocate for their patients. Mary, an elderly Black woman, became a symbol of the fight against bias and racism in healthcare. Her story, full of pain and hope, raised important questions, forcing society to consider how it could change. And perhaps that is where true strength lay, in stepping forward even when it seems like the whole world is against you, and in learning to speak out about pain so that others can be heard. Her journey was just beginning, but she was ready to go all the way, confident that change was possible if people had the courage to fight for their truth. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.